Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis. And I have with me today on Free Thinking Forum, John Anfinson, who is Superintendent of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. Hello.
Hi.
Good to meet up with you. And tell us a little bit about what it is you do.
Well, as Superintendent of the National Park, I guess I'm in charge of the whole thing. And I get to set kind of the agenda and solve issues and problems, hopefully, that this national park deals with.
And how big is the park?
It is a 72-mile-long reach of the Mississippi River, including the last 4 miles, or first 4, of the Minnesota River, through the Twin Cities metropolitan area.
Right, which is one of the oddities of our downtown, is that it has this storied river running right through the middle of it.
Yes, and so, you know, it's not just a storied river, it's a really unique reach of the Mississippi River. When we were created in 1988 as a national park, they identified 7 different resources that we needed to overlook and why this river was nationally significant here.
And we were talking beforehand, and you were mentioning that there are 3 Mississippis, essentially. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I like to ask locals as well as people from out of town. I'll say, how many Mississippis are there in the Twin Cities? And people look very confused when I do that. But the river changes here more than anywhere else on its entire course to the Gulf of Mexico. So the park begins at the top of Hennepin County with the Crow River and ends below Hastings in the Vermilion River bottoms at the bottom of Dakota County. But in that 72 miles, we have a prairie river, a river with not really high bluffs or banks in the northern part of the corridor where our corridor starts. And there's not a lot of floodplain and not a lot of islands. There's some islands. And then at St. Anthony Falls, it drops into about an 8.5-mile gorge, the tightest, narrowest canyon anywhere on the Mississippi. Third to a quarter mile across on top, 80 to 100-foot bluffs. And the river descends about 110 feet over that 8.5 miles. So about an 11-story building over that distance. And then at the mouth of the Minnesota River, right by Fort Snelling, near the airport, it opens up into this broad floodplain river, the river most people think of when they think of Mark Twain and the Mississippi.
Well, and I grew up in the confluence of the Ohio River and the Mississippi. So my Mississippi River is certainly that big one that's always flooding and moving the islands around and meandering off and separating states in different points at different floods and that. And I only moved up here in my adult life, and I was quite fascinated by, wow, this is a different river.
It really is a different river up here. I mean, well, in downtown St. Paul, when you can stand up in Mounds Park overlooking the valley, and you can look down for 7 miles from some places up there because the valley is so big and open, and see the back channels and the side channels and the floodplain, versus standing up in Coon Rapids or Fridley, and the river's very narrow, and it's just not, you can't see as far at all. So it's a very different river. Or if you're in the gorge, that tight, narrow canyon, you can be canoeing down in that gorge and see the trees and the bluffs all around and not even realize you're in the heart of a big city.
Well, and then around Fort Snelling, seeing the eagles, and tell me a little bit about the wildlife and the changes that have happened in the last few years along the Mississippi around here.
Well, since the banning in particular of DDT, you know, when DDT was being used a lot in agriculture, a lot of the raptors had disappeared. A lot of the eagles and the hawks and the falcons. And now they've really made a tremendous comeback. We have been through one of our partner national park units, the Inventory Monitoring Network out of Ashland, Wisconsin. They send scientists down almost every year to monitor the number of eagle nests in the corridor, the 72-mile corridor, and take blood and feather samples to see from the young to see how they're doing. Because since they eat mostly things from the river, how healthy is the river? And when they began doing this, we were maybe around, in 2007, maybe around 20 nests. And now we are almost at 50 eagles nests in the corridor. And there's usually, you might see 1 or 2 eaglets in the nests, but we're seeing up to 4, 3 and 4. 3 is more common. So very productive and healthy nests.
And so I guess that means the fish are healthier too.
Well, not necessarily,
Oh.
because when you look at what the fish are eating, or what the eagles are eating, you know, if it's down by Pig's Eye Lake in St. Paul, where there was a battery dump at one point, we see higher levels of lead in the fish. We see higher levels of mercury in some other areas. The perfluorinated chemicals that, you know, the flame retardants. We used to see those at a high point at one point, but now that those aren't used anymore, the eagles, it's really, you know, decreasing fast within the eagles.
So does that mean there is a sort of time limit to this industrial pollution that we've now stopped putting into the river, that it will slowly heal? Is that?
Well, the interesting thing is we are seeing a real drop in DDT in the eagles here. And some of the breakdown chemicals, we're seeing some of those, DDE, in eagles. But up in the Apostle Islands, where they're also measuring eagles and looking at eagles, the DDT seems to be staying there more with them. And they think it might be the fact that, you know, it's the colder, deeper waters of the Great Lakes isn't breaking it down as fast, whereas the river is constantly churning and carrying things away. So maybe our river is flushing itself better.
Interesting, interesting, interesting. Well, that gets me to the education piece of what you do. Tell me a little bit about some of the education programs that you're doing.
Well, we've really developed some fabulous programs with schools in the Twin Cities area. One of them is Big River Journey, where we get kids on paddle boats, one of the paddle boats with a paddle boat company, the Paddleford Packet Boat Company. And we get them on with a number of different partners, the DNR, and we've had Fish and Wildlife, and we've had others on. And the kids get to go to different stations, and they learn about, you know, history, and they learn about nature, and they learn about eagles and otters and other things, and science and water quality. And so they go to these different stations, and we've had, I think, over 60,000 kids go through that program in Big River Journey on this paddle boat. We've also started a great partnership with Wilderness Inquiry through help from the Mississippi River Fund and others, where we get kids, 5th to 8th graders in particular, from the Minneapolis-St. Paul schools, and we put them in these Voyager canoes, these 10-person canoes, and take them out on the Mississippi. And most of these kids, you know, are urban youth who have really never maybe been in a boat on a body of water anywhere. And then we're putting them on the Mississippi, which, you know, even the schools were a little leery of that at first. But Wilderness Inquiry has so much experience out in nature with boats that they just know absolutely what they're doing. So we get these kids out, and they start canoeing, and they start kind of, they don't always paddle together. So we're trying to teach them how to work together to all paddle in unison. Then they get out at different points, and they'll, you know, seine the waters near their shore and collect little fish, or they'll collect mussels, or they'll look at, you know, they'll go walk into the woods, or in some cases we have them do like a fur trading exercise, where some kids get goods and some kids get furs, and they have to start having a negotiation on what are they going to trade for, kind of going to the history of the river.
Interesting. But before we get to the history, now, where is your main headquarters?
Our main headquarters is downtown St. Paul, in an apartment building of all things. That's where our main headquarters is. But we have a visitor center in the Science Museum of Minnesota. So right when you walk into the Science Museum, we are just to your right in a classic National Park Service visitor center.
And it's a beautiful place. I love going there. And again, reflecting, because most of my experience is the southern part of the river, and it's always great to look around in there.
So I should just address that, you know, the river, I mean, different parts of it, in national park units. So they try to designate national park units, not repeat the same thing too many times. So we are the only national park whose focus is the Mississippi River. So while we're focused on 72 miles, we do want to tell the stories of the whole river. Down to Cairo, where
I'm from.
Yes.
Yep. Does the river go through any more metropolitan areas in the same way that it does here?
In the same way, not quite. I mean, it goes by St. Louis, of course,
yes.
East St. Louis and St. Louis, so there's a big metropolitan area. And there's a big national park unit there, the Arch, in Jefferson National Expansion. But that's not, they don't tell the story of the river at all.
No.
They focus on westward expansion and other things. And I had the pleasure of just being down this summer, actually on a pleasure late July, early August in New Orleans, and got to visit Jean Lafitte National Battlefield and New Orleans Jazz National Park and Barataria, this big reserve out in the bayous, and a very different experience.
It's a different river down there.
Yes.
With a different kind of quality to it.
But there are these national park units along the river, but this is the one that focuses on that river story.
Interesting. Well, let's think a little bit about the history. So we know that the Twin Cities are the Twin Cities because of the river. Walk us back a little bit so we can think about how it comes back.
So why is there a Twin Cities? Would be a question most people would ask. Why two big cities so close to each other? So the main difference is the gorge, that 8.5 mile stretch of river. You know, prior to anything we did to the river, prior to locks and dams and navigation improvements, that 110-foot drop created such a rapids that boats simply couldn't go up it. St. Anthony Falls, which is in Minneapolis today, began downtown St. Paul. And when the glacier started melting, this big river formed draining Glacial Lake Agassiz in Canada, in northwestern Minnesota. And it flowed down the Minnesota River, down the Red and down the Minnesota, came in at Fort Snelling, where Fort Snelling is today, and then flowed down the Mississippi. And you know, the river today is lucky if it has 8,000 cubic feet per second in it at this time, with winter coming on. And at that time, it had about 1 million cubic feet per second. So the river valley was just full and flowing on and off for 2,500 years, draining this glacial lake. So it created this big river. But it also came over that limestone riverbed that we have here. And then it got into the sandstone bluffs. You'll see the geology downtown St. Paul of limestone bluffs, some shale in between, and then sandstone, really fine sandstone. And so as this giant waterfall formed downtown St. Paul, it ate away the sandstone underneath the limestone, and the waterfall started retreating upriver till it got to eventually where St. Anthony is. But it left all these big boulders in the Mississippi. So, you know, when explorers started coming up, Stephen Long in 1817 says he went up the gorge in a 6-oared skiff. He had 6 men rowing, a sail up, someone poling, and they could not make headway into the rapids. It was so powerful. Wow. They had to get out, tie a rope around the front of the boat, and pull it up. And so in the late 1850s, steamboats come and go from St. Paul 1,000 times. They leave and go 1,000 times, and 50 times from Minneapolis. And so Minneapolis desperately wants to be the head of navigation, but that gorge is just impossible. So Minneapolis pays the steamboat Lamartine $500 to be able to come up the gorge and prove that navigation is possible in Minneapolis. And it makes it and goes back. But most people look to the voyage of the Fanny Harris. It makes it up, but on coming back down, it's got 2 wing rudders that steer the boat, and hits one of those big boulders left by the retreat of St. Anthony and knocks off the wing rudder. And the pilot panics and leaves the wheel, and these 2 older pilots are in back, and they write this account where they said, had we not grabbed the steering wheel, we'd have been smashed to kindlings. And didn't tell the engineer in the boiler room, because they wanted to keep feeding the boiler so they have a full head of steam going through the 6 miles of rapids they're in, just so they could get through it. So, you know, there's just not much navigation. But what does that steep drop in water power mean? Well, it means that Minneapolis can become the milling center of the nation and at times the world. So by 1880, Minneapolis from 1880 to 1930 will be the #1 flour producing city in the country. And St. Paul becomes the head of navigation because of that gorge. So that's why we have the Twin Cities, is because of the very character of the river here.
Yeah, and it's quite a beautiful view when you get up above those falls, and
Yes.
you know, and again, it's the river is still powerful there. I mean, the feel of the water rushing, and so they were using water power. And were able to do that. I think on down the river, the Ford plant now has an abandoned turbine, right? Near the Ford plant, where they used to have a mill or a generator, or.
Well, there's actually at Lock and Dam 1. Most people call it the Ford Dam, even though Ford came in later than the dam was built. They did build a hydropower unit on the dam at that time because the Corps couldn't under federal law at that time. So, you know, Henry Ford builds the plant because he wants to get hydropower. He sees it as a new energy, and he wanted to build a plant that could draw on hydropower. And so Lock and Dam had been completed in 1917. He comes in 1923 and realizes this is a huge opportunity. So he builds the power plant there. Now that Ford is going away and it no longer has the plant, I believe it was sold to a Canadian company. So it's still generating about 12, 13 megawatts of power.
Really?
Yep.
So it's still in operation. I had no
It
idea. I
is.
mean, the old turbine is sitting out, by the
Yes.
side of the river, and it's quite an impressive piece of steel for a water to move. After
Yes.
all, so I guess Ford then never really had any idea of shipping cars down the river. He was always involved in railroads for that, the transportation of his cars. It was the power of the river that he was after for the generation of electricity for the.
Yes, but there are some great photos in the Minnesota Historical Society's archives of a Model T being loaded onto a barge there, right below the Ford plant. So I think they contemplated it, but my guess is the time of delivery became an issue.
well, the Mississippi still doesn't always cooperate with time schedules with barges, does it?
Oh, it doesn't, especially the last year, which was really difficult for navigation.
Flooding and then drying up and flooding and drying up, or?
It was mainly flooding and high water, which then delivered a massive amounts of sediment from the Minnesota River down into the river in the Twin Cities below Fort Snelling, so that there were serious issues of trying to get through Lock and Dam 2 down at Hastings. It was just they couldn't run the normal 15 barge tow because there was so much sediment that it plugged the channel down there.
So at one time, were there riverboat companies operating out of St. Paul then, or were most of those in the New Orleans or St. Louis area and just coming up here, or how did that operate?
So most steamboats operated out of other places downriver. There were some out of St. Paul. What people don't realize is that there wasn't a steady growth of commerce on the river. Once steamboats started, there would be this just steady increase in navigation. Actually, by the time Lock and Dam 1 opens in 1917, there is no through commerce on the upper Mississippi anymore. There are no boats that go from St. Paul to St. Louis or down. It's all probably 10 to 12 miles between origin and destination, and it's building early navigation structures called wing dams.
I'll be darned.
So commerce is essentially dead by 1917 on the Mississippi.
Interesting. Well, so I know you've written a book about how human beings have affected the river itself. And tell me a little bit about that. How have we, both, I hope improved it, but also messed it up in some ways, or how do you look at that, the human effects?
So we did a number of things to the river before the locks and dams came in, mainly in the 1930s. But so commerce is dead by 1917, and the Midwest is facing a situation where it has to say, do we still want to be the head of navigation or not? And railroads are starting to charge really high prices. So the only way to create competition for the railroads is to have a navigable river. And that means doing something very different than they've been doing before. So in the 1920s, in particular, the Twin Cities began a movement for a whole new project for the Mississippi to put locks and dams the whole length of the upper river from St. Louis up. And they win, and they get that in the 1930s. And locks and dams 3 through 26 from Red Wing down to just above St. Louis at Alton, Illinois are built in the 1930s. And so what that does is, by the 1980s, there's over 80 million tons of commerce moving on the upper Mississippi River a year. And commerce comes back dramatically. And so navigation really comes back with the locks and dams. But the consequences is that the river is an ecosystem that relies on high water in the spring and then it falling to very low water in the fall. And so that that fluctuation was critical to ecosystem resurgence. And so as the river went down, plants like the arrowhead could root themselves and they could start growing in the sediment in the river. And then when there's usually a fall bump in the water and the migratory waterfall would come through, they could eat the roots of the arrowhead and survive and have plenty of food. What the dams do right now is they hold the river up. There's no flood control capacity of these dams. When the Mississippi goes up, they just roll up the gates or it flows over the top of a fixed crest spillway. But as the river goes down, they start putting the dam gates back into the river and hold it up as reservoirs. And so that the bottom part of that pulse is gone today. And so what we started seeing by the 1960s and 70s was erosion of all the islands above the dams and these big open areas and the sediment in the river starting to level out, and the arrowhead and other aquatic plants disappearing, and islands disappearing. So it was having significant ecosystem impacts. In fact, by the 1980s, people are predicting the river is going to die ecologically. So in 1986, Congress authorizes the Environmental Management Program, which begins working with the Corps of Engineers and other partners to begin rebuilding islands and to building channel connections between backwaters and the main channel to kind of to mimic and bring back the ecological function of the river.
I'll be darned. And how's that working?
You know, there's no, I don't think there's a specific report card that says we've turned the tide, it's changing, but it's made a big difference. There's been very successful programs of island rebuilding and you know, instead of having big open expanses of water, having these islands back in there that can protect the wind from blowing across those reservoirs, because when it did that, it would stir up the sediment, which would then block the light, which blocked photosynthesis, so the plants couldn't grow. So now they've created these barriers to that wind and that erosion.
So I guess there's no proposal just to take those locks and dams out and let it go again.
Well, again, the issue there is half of the Midwest grain moves by barge. A lot of the fertilizer comes up. The economic impacts would be phenomenal if you took out the locks and dams. And there's hydropower, and there's a lot of the sanitary systems and some of the water supply systems rely on that navigation system that's in place.
So they're not going anywhere soon.
Not anywhere soon.
What would happen if they were all gone? I mean, would it be not a navigable river north of some point?
So from the 1880s, 1878, up until the 1930s, the Corps of Engineers had tried using something called channel constriction. They built these wing dams, these long piers of rock and brush into the Mississippi, and they would put them in a series. It'd be like taking a garden hose and turning down the nozzle on the garden hose. And the more you turn down the nozzle, the faster the water flows.
Right.
So that's where you pinch the river, it scours itself, and then it puts the sediment in between the wing dams, and the banks start growing in, and you have a much narrower river. So those are underneath the water right now. And they had ribbed the entire upper Mississippi River with the wing dams.
So they're still there.
They're still there. So but they were trying to create a 4.5-foot channel first, and then a 6-foot channel. The locks and dams today create a 9-foot channel. And all those numbers are based on the low water year of 1864. It means if the river gets as low as it was in 1864, there would be 4.5, 6, or 9 feet of water in the Mississippi. But under those wing dam projects, the average depth of the water in St. Paul was only about 3.5 feet.
No kidding.
In some places they worked, in some places they didn't. So the commerce went to the railroads. The natural Mississippi, what most people don't realize, is the natural river. The average depth from St. Paul down to the Wisconsin border was maybe 24 inches.
Really?
18 to 24 inches. All the way down to St. Louis, it was, you know, under 3 feet. And so when Zebulon Pike starts up in 1805, he's going to come up, the first American explorer to come up the Mississippi. He's got this big keelboat, and just outside of St. Louis, it grounds, and he's in the water pushing his keelboat up the river. And in 1824, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, who would later go on to find the headwaters at Lake Itasca, he's coming down from Fort Snelling and going downriver, and he says it would be surprising if they didn't hit 16 to 20 sandbars in a day. And he was in a birch bark canoe.
Well, that was going to be my next question is, I mean, how did the native peoples use it when it was in its natural state?
So it was this phenomenally plentiful resource for them. Every spring when the river flooded in the natural conditions, adult fish would go into the backwaters and spawn. And as the river fell, the adult fish would come back, but the fingerlings would remain in the backwaters, to the tune of hundreds and hundreds of millions. And so they became kind of all-you-could-eat restaurants for all kinds of you know, herons and other wildlife. And so American Indians had access to the fish and the other wildlife. And like I said, there were buffalo still at the time that would cross the Mississippi. In 1680, when Father Lewis Hennepin came up the Mississippi, he discovers a herd of buffalo going across the river below the Twin Cities.
I'll be darned.
So it was it was their superstore of everything.
Yeah, yeah, interesting, interesting. In the last few minutes we have, I do want to ask about the centennial of the National Park System, yes?
Yes.
Coming up in 2016.
2016, we'll be 100 years old.
Okay, what's going to go on?
Well, we're still thinking about that. We are still in the planning. We hope it's a big party, but we also really want it to be about communities and partners. What can we do with the communities of the Twin Cities who are on this river to celebrate, that there's a national park here in the Twin Cities? And we also want to look at, there's 5 other national park units within Minnesota. So we want to celebrate all the national parks here. And so we're going to start talking to partners, start getting out there next year in 2015 and get all the ideas for programs and events and projects that we can maybe work with our partners on to celebrate the centennial. What I look at is, you think of Yellowstone. Cody, Wyoming is just outside Yellowstone Park. It's called a gateway community. And there are other gateway communities around national parks, International Falls to Voyageurs National Park. But we should think of the 25 communities on this river in the Twin Cities as all gateway communities, not just to this park, but gateways to getting people to all the national parks in the national park system.
Interesting. You said, I would not have gotten that trivia question right. Do you offhand know what are the 5 national parks in the state?
There are 6, actually.
6.
Mississippi National River and Recreation Area is 1.
All right.
There's Pipestone National Monument down the southwest corner.
Okay.
St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, just over on the St. Croix.
Okay.
There's Grand Portage National Monument up by the Arrowhead, the very tip of the Arrowhead of Minnesota. Voyageurs National Park. And then there's one that nobody hardly knows about called the North Country Trail, which is a trail that runs through Minnesota, then all the way out east. And it's part of a big, long, over 4,000-mile national trail.
There's quite a bit of diversity to
Exactly.
those different parks then.
So we have 401 units of the national park system in America. Soon to be 402, we think. So, and they're very, there's there's maybe over 30 different designations.
No kidding. But so how many national parks are in urban areas then? Because that is one of the interesting things about this one.
I don't know the exact number and what you define as urban. There aren't a lot.
That's what I was thinking.
But you think of the Capitol Mall in Washington, D.C. is a national park. The White House is a national park unit.
I didn't think of that.
Statue of Liberty. And Grant's tomb.
Okay,
and so there's
that's
all these,
true. I was thinking of waterways and trees.
Exactly. So there are all these historical parks and presidential homes and national battlefields. They're all part of the national park system. So there are these stories of nature and culture.
So it was Teddy Roosevelt who signed this into law, or back in 1916. How did the park system start?
Well, it started, Ken Burns has done this phenomenal series on, the origins of the national park system, multi-part series on looking at the very origins. And it was a difficult birth, trying to get people to protect resources that, people had other ideas for. And to really create the national park idea was the first time in the world. We become the world model for national parks. You can look around the world today and see other national parks in other countries. It's because of this model created here.
And was it because we obviously had such a huge geographic area with so much diversity that kind of gave rise to the idea that we needed to preserve some of this?
Well, it was individual champions, and John Muir with Yosemite, and there were heroes of the parks out east and the Grand Canyon and others who just realized that these places were so special and so unique that they had to be protected for all Americans.
Wow.
And that's the beauty of the national park system. It's for all Americans.
Well, thank you for being one of the champions of our national park system and for joining me today. John Efrenson, and we can find more information at the National Park website, no doubt about that.
Yep.
And find out about your books. I'm David Breeden, the Senior Minister at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis. Thank you for joining us today.